Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Balkan Devlen, a director of the European Institute at the Macdonald-Dory Institute, with me today, talking about some articles that he's written recently about foreign affairs, international relations, Donald Trump, the United States, etc., but also, where he thinks the world is going. Sir, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Brian.
So you were saying before we got on that you really you want people to understand that we shouldn't take Donald Trump too seriously? Is that, or what he says too seriously? Is that what you're saying? What your argument is?
No. There is a line that is sometimes attributed to Peter Thiel, the famous venture capitalist who backed J.D. Vance and others within the Republican Party and endorsed Trump in 2016. One of the first VC coming out of Silicon Valley that endorsed them. He says that you should take Donald Trump seriously, but not literally. In the sense that there is an intention there, but the words themselves are not necessarily the exact thing that he wants to do. I mean, increasingly not sure whether we should not take him literally as well. But the idea that Donald Trump have both the attention, political power, political capital, and the resources to do everything he says he wants to do, I think is a bit mistaken, and we need to stop being reactive. If you think about it, to Donald Trump's ideas, you cannot really play a whack-a-mole with everything he says.
So this past week, some people said, he should stop joking about taking over Canada, and the response was, no, he's not joking, he's serious. So you're saying,
no, I mean,
he wasn't joking and he wasn't serious?
No. I think so. When you look at threat, right? A threat needs to have two components. One is the intent, intent to do harm, and the second is the capabilities. Can you harm? Right? A little kitten might have all the intention in the world to grab that one big piece of beef from the counter, but that kitten will not have the capability to grab that big piece of meat from the counter. So because it's very hard to get into the minds of anybody, right? But Donald Trump may be looking at the map and thinking that, oh, there is this big, great, lovely island up here in Greenland. Well, because I don't understand Mercator production, it looks bigger than it actually is. I want to get that. And Canada, why do we have it? We might go. He might have, in that sense, serious in his mind. That doesn't mean that he will have the capabilities to pursue that specific policy. So in that sense, personally, it is of secondary importance whether he is serious or not. What we really need to be looking at is whether he has the resources and the means and the political capital and the money, etc., to do what he wants to do. One needs to remember that Donald Trump is very good at backtracking on things that he said and the policies he advocated.
Well, it was like 2 or 3 days after he called
Zelensky dictator.
A dictator. He says, "Did I ever say that? I never said that."
That's like the latest example. My favorite example is the TikTok issue. He was the one who forced the Republicans to push for a bipartisan bill in the Congress to ban TikTok. And then suddenly the investment fund that happened to have a significant investment in TikTok donated, something around like $100 million or so into his super PAC. And suddenly he goes like, well, free speech, maybe we shouldn't, right? So he has, as I said before we start talking, he has dispositions. He has particular intuitions about how the world works, but not necessarily a well laid out strategic rationale that he is willing to step by step follow. There is no 7-dimensional chess here that he is softening up to do something. He is setting up the stage for this, etc. Donald Trump, in one sense, as someone pointed out, he was not necessarily a successful businessman. He played one on TV. He bankrupted 6 times. He made his money by suing people and not paying. So this is not necessarily a someone both dispositionally, as his life story suggests, someone who has a long-term vision in which he follows. So we need to, in that sense, be more, going back to the Second World War, slogan, keep calm and carry on.
So it's interesting because there was this interesting debate that I saw a little while ago about whether his strategy was no strategy and was completely haphazard. Whatever thought he came up with at 2 o'clock in the morning, there's the strategy that he announced the next morning, or was this chaotic strategy part of his whole strategy? That the chaos ended up being critically important to provide uncertainty, and so therefore the contention was, for an example, on tariffs, that without actually ever having to put the tariffs in place, just the threat of the tariffs was accomplishing the goal of returning manufacturing in the United States. So is Donald Trump's chaotic process a strategy or a lack of strategy?
So if the outcomes look the same, it's going to be very hard to determine the specific motivations behind it, right? So how we can differentiate whether it is actually a specific strategy to lead to a particular outcome versus how he's just basically throwing things and figuring out. I think there are multiple ways you can do it, but one, I would say, yardstick we can measure whether this is a well thought out of strategy or not is he sticking to specific policies that are attached to that economic end goal, which is reindustrialization of the United States, manufacturing, etc. There is no doubt there are people in Trump orbit, both in the administration and outside in the think tanks, that believe that this is a first step towards reindustrialization of the United States will be essential if the US is getting ready for a war with China, because you cannot have a defense industrial base by itself. It has to rely on a broader industrial base of producing things, and therefore you need to get there before you get to a self-sustaining defense industrial base and getting you ready to war. Now, I have no doubt that there are people, and we know that people exist like that in his orbit. That doesn't mean that that's exactly the way Donald Trump thinks about the tariffs. He is, as I said before, he changes his mind off all the time. But one thing he was quite consistent is that his view is that in any transaction, there's always a winner and a loser. Right. So this, of course, runs counter to anything and everything we know about modern economic discipline in terms of the benefits of competitive advantage, free trade, etc., etc. But he has been very consistent that this is a zero-sum thing. If you win, I lose. So I don't want to lose. I don't want to be dependent on anybody. I need to be the one. So it's a much more what the economists would call a neo-mercantilist, an autarkic way of thinking. It doesn't mean that it is a part of a bigger strategy that needs to be attached to a bigger vision. But the end stage might end up being that if he can consistently pursue that. So the payoffs, the end game may end up being that way. Would it be? I don't know. I think he is too mercurial and too short-term thinking about that, because through his actions he's also undermining significantly trust and in U.S. ability to keep promises. Is a fundamental component of international law, as you said. As you know, the promises must be kept, pacta sunt servanda. And if he is willing to rip up any agreement that he himself signed, as the conditions change right away, that will be very hard for the United States. U.S. is not as a trade-dependent country as Canada. I think Canada it depends on its trade broadly for its GDP about 50%, including exports and imports. U.S. is somewhere between 15 to 20% in total, exports and imports. It's not a very trade-dependent country, but it's prosperity to a certain extent relies on United States being seen as a reliable ally, both on the trade, economy, and the military component. It gives the opportunity for the US dollar to be the world's reserve currency. There's a book even called The Exorbitant Privilege that comes from that particular fact, etc., etc. By destroying the basis of this system, Donald Trump is fundamentally undermining the United States' long-term prosperity and security. He may end up getting short-term investments because companies go like, the tariff walls are going up, we better be inside. But then, people would adjust, countries adapt. We all do. And once that flow to the United States stops and everybody finds alternatives, the long-term perspective then starts turning negative for the United States.
What you just said is that you think what Donald Trump is doing is negative toward America's long-term prosperity and security.
Absolutely. I don't think he is. Again, the political leaders and ours need to do the same. Need to put their country's national interest first, right? That is why people elect them, to defend their prosperity and security and well-being first and foremost. That should be the goal of any democratically elected leader. My fundamental criticism of Donald Trump is not as is a Canadian looking outside and saying that what you're doing is harming us. It is harming us, but he might go like, if it is beneficial for my country, good luck. My argument is that his policies are not only harming friends and allies like Canada, but also he is harming medium to long-term American national interests, that it is undermining the American power. And we have to be very frank. We here in Canada and the broader Western world benefited significantly from the American power and the world that it created. People may complain about Pax Americana and American hegemony after the Second World War, etc., but we need to really recognize that a functioning, relatively stable international system, including international trade, has been crucial for our own prosperity and security. So we will miss it when it goes. It is a very self-interested argument from our perspective too. We benefited. Americans benefited significantly. You are undermining not only our interests and our security in this particular system and threatening that, but you are also fundamentally not understanding the implications of what your policies could lead to, and therefore undermine American national interest.
So
I'm not expecting him to be altruistic. My argument is that you are, cutting your nose to spite your face.
Well, it's more than your nose if it's your long-term prosperity and security. But what you're saying in your article, and I put this, you don't say in your article, but he's saying "Make America Great Again." What you're saying here in your article is, and I quote, "An insular, if not isolationist, administration is nearly as grave a geopolitical risk to the world's democracy as an imperialistic one. After all, the U.S.'s forward deployment and active diplomatic engagement abroad have helped secure Canada, Europe, and the West Pacific since the 1950s. The Trump administration is now choosing to put that security in jeopardy."
That is true. I would recommend, so in that article, Richard Shimooka and Alexander Donashka and I make the case that it is important to look at what people do as much as what they say. And one of the best, indicators of what you're willing to do is where you're willing to spend your money on, right? Someone can say that I'm very generous, I love helping people, but if you look at it and they do no charitable giving, you go like, are you really engaging in that? In a similar way, you might talk about, I'm going to annex here, I'm going to take there, I'm going to show this way, that way, but then if you're spending money on defense issues that is primarily focused on hemispheric defense, on long range fires, his Golden Dome, the missile defense system, nuclear modernization, etc., and if there are plans and news reports going around that forward deployments, particularly in Europe, but coming afterwards, other places will be decreased, you can then start thinking about where is he putting his money, right? and what that particular means. And it is important. I mean, Hal Brand's a famous analyst of American foreign policy out of American Enterprise Institute, has a recent book. He has written on this quite significantly before. But his basic argument is called the Eurasian century. His basic argument is that the reason why the United States, after the Second World War, engaged in this forward deployments in Europe and in Indo-Pacific, in Japan and South Korea and other places, and created this system of safe passage throughout the high seas, this global commons, etc., is the experience of the early 20th century, in which the Americans twice have to intervene at great cost, both in terms of treasure and blood, to prevent a Eurasian hegemon rising and fundamentally threatening United States. Germany was in the first case, and of course later on Germany and Japan in the Second World War, and then the Soviet Union in the Cold War. In other words, it was easier, it was more beneficial for the Americans to ensure that the threats over the horizon remain over the horizon, and therefore that requires stabilizing the Eurasian continent from Europe all the way to the Indo-Pacific. Because if you don't, eventually the developments there would come to the shores of the United States. And today it's even more the case given the technological development, et cetera, et cetera. So it was not out of the good heart of the American presidents, but an enlightened understanding of the self-interest that those costs that the U.S. paid to maintain a stable, peaceful international system over there is cheaper to do than delaying, kicking the can down the road, watching the rise of a Eurasian hegemon, and then going and fighting a war there at a great cost. So what this strategy is doing is, though, completely washing their hands off that particular way of.
So what he's saying is Europe's got to take care of itself. And what you're saying is the history suggests Europe won't take care of itself, and America's going to have to come in and spend a lot more money later on anyway.
It is highly possible. It is highly possible that Europe might try to take care of itself. It might be too late to do so. It might not be quick enough. It might try to engage in, but in balancing and pushing back against Russia itself. But that's not the only threat. Of course, the bigger threat is China, and China is not only in the Pacific one. Once the Chinese secure their regional hegemony in East Asia, they will, as all hegemons do, start looking outside, which would include, again, through their client state, at that stage Russia, through Europe, so on and so forth. So you will see the rise of Russia-China axis, and whether Europe will have the resources by itself to do that is a different story. If they don't, then they might have to hedge or side with that rise of Russia-China axis, and then you suddenly have a whole continent with a lot of people and a lot of resources poised in a hostile structure against North America. And we have to remember that. I mean, the basic fundamental sort of bargain of NATO was that North America, both United States and Canada, remain as sanctuaries of Western power, right? So that we can marshal the resources of this continent if there is a threat that emerged in Europe, and we can project that power over there, so that we can deal with it over there and not over here. And I think breaking that particular bargain is going to be very, very costly for the United States, and of course, it will also be quite costly for us.
We're chatting tonight with Balkan Devlen. He's written a really interesting article with some co-authors called "Donald Trump's Budget Priorities Are a Sign of an Insular America, Not an Imperial One." And I think a lot of our concerns have been about this imperialistic America that wants to take over Greenland, Panama, and Canada. And they're arguing the opposite, that frankly, America is removing itself from geopolitical involvement, and that's also a risk. We're going to take a break but also I want to come back and ask our expert today about a couple of other articles he's written in regards to the Liberal Party on the road to Damascus. That's an interesting one. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes.
Sure.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Balkan Devlen. He is a speaker, a writer, and he advises on international affairs, geopolitics, forecasting, and foresight, turning hindsight into foresight. He is the director of transatlantic program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And sir, you call yourself a super forecaster. What the heck is a super forecaster?
Well, I don't necessarily call myself that, but there was a nice sort of branding that was given as a result of a geopolitical forecasting competition that United States Director of National Intelligence, the Office of Director of National Intelligence, had back in 2011, 2015. It was part of a open project in which they invited people to forecast on hundreds of questions on geopolitics and geoeconomics. And for those who are consistently in the top 2% of in terms of accuracy, they, instead of saying that, oh, these guys are surprisingly consistently accurate across hundreds of questions, they say, well, we're going to call you super forecasters. That's why I always tend to put that as either as in quotation marks or with a TM, because it is not what something I call myself necessarily, but someone
Well, we're
else.
going to have to find out what your super forecasting is. I want to ask you, though, if I could next, about an article that you wrote just a little while ago about a dizzyingly shift is happening in Canada's center left. But don't be fooled. The sudden embrace of a stronger national identity and a renewed focus on defense spending is plainly less about a genuine shift in values and more about political convenience. Really?
I think so. I mean, as I said, there are two explanations for it, right? What the liberals, broadly speaking, McCartney and others, showed in the past 3 months. One is that they suddenly saw the light that, oh, yes, the policies that we have pursued, including when it comes to energy and natural resources, the defense spending through those famous line just about 2 years ago, even not that, saying that we will never get to 2% in a private conversation to the NATO leaders. The whole carbon tax debate, et cetera, et cetera. Suddenly, in the last 3 months, they saw the light, and they suddenly changed their mind. That's one explanation. To me, that's highly problematic. Let's assume that is the case. They suddenly have this road to Damascus moment. What does that tell to Canadians about their ability to foresee challenges, change tact when before it is too late? It is not that these policies have not been criticized, alternatives have been pointed out, and the consequences of pursuing these things have not been pointed out again and again and again. So first, if they were late 9 years to change this policy, what does that tell their competence level in terms of seeing things and changing policy and pursuing a well thought out foresight going forward? So it makes me question their competence. The second part is that if they are not genuine, and then this is a cynical ploy to take advantage of Donald Trump's rhetoric and threats, as we talked before. It created very naturally what the political scientists will call rally around the flag effect, and it then pushes all the political leaders and political parties to wrap themselves in the flag and then put that particular identity and use this as an opportunity to pivot away. Whether this represents a through change of heart, it's very hard for me to buy into that one. This is the same people who put those policies and just 6 months ago were heartily defending them. And calling anyone who is not, supporting their policies as not being good patriots. This is the party that regularly call Canada a genocidal state, and suddenly wrapping themselves in the flag and putting forward much more nationalistic themes. You'll excuse me if I don't buy into that sudden conversion.
So maybe, and I'm far from a religious scholar, but maybe I don't understand the road to Damascus analogy, because I thought the road to Damascus actually ended up being one of the most important improvements and changes in Christian history. So Saul was, as you correctly pointed out, negative toward Christianity and to Christ. But then on the road to Damascus, he changes his tune,
Yes.
and ends up becoming the force of Christianity.
Yeah.
Changes his name to Paul, and
Yeah.
ends up writing supposedly more than half the Bible,
Yeah.
or at least half the New Testament. Traveling around the Mediterranean more than anyone else, and really, growing. And some people
Yeah.
think that Jesus was the start of Christianity, but without Paul, it never would have grown to the force that it was. So, you say, but make no mistake, this isn't awakening or a true change of heart. It's a desperate attempt to save face, a road to Damascus moment that comes too late and rings hollow in the wake of years of mismanagement. I would have thought the opposite. If it's actually a Damascus moment, that's great. That they're actually going to be the people that
Yeah.
finally firmly believe and take it forward and make a huge change.
Yes, and I mean, sort of, my argument there is that this is the way they want to present it, but that is not a true road to Damascus moment. It is the way it is being presented is that we saw in the light that things have changed, the conditions have changed. That has been the line coming from, Carney, from Champagne, from Finland, etc. Now the reason why we are shifting things is that we change our perspective. That is their line. And that's why I don't believe that this is a road to Damascus moment for them. It is the way they portray it as such, and saying that, look, this is a true change of heart. We are changing our ways. We have a true conversion here. And my argument is that no, not really. This is the way they present it, but it is in a way a Fox, road to Damascus moment. It is not a real one. And I would actually have significant issues if they truly suddenly only now saw things in a different way, which is, again, that's, I don't know which one is worse. I don't know which one is a worse outcome. Being a cynical political operation in terms of this is where the people are moving right now, so we need to take advantage of this, versus, oh, the world wasn't what it was, we thought, despite the fact that everyone was screaming at us, and now we will be good leaders to chart the way in this very treacherous geopolitical moment. I'm not sure which one. I would probably prefer the cynical version rather than this completely naive version of trusting people who obviously were not ready to handle that. So that's my concern. Either way, though, I think it is quite rich of them to claim that particular mantle.
You say in your article, the irony is stark. While our allies have been urging Canada to step up, to invest in continental security, to secure the Arctic, and to honor our commitments to NATO, the government has been busy cutting corners and sidestepping tough choices. The sudden embrace of stronger national identity and a renewed focus on defense spending is plainly less about a genuine shift in values and more about political convenience, which obviously is the argument you're making. Let me, however, if I could, go back and I'm going to try to paraphrase Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and I'm not going to get it close to right, but and I can't remember the topic. I think it might have been about wage and price controls at one point in time. But he was challenged by a reporter who said, "You've changed your tune," and his response was, "Well, when I get a whole bunch of new facts and new explanations, I listen to them, and if they're right, I change my conclusion. What do you do? Always, no matter what the facts are, you stay with the same point of view?" So he was effectively criticizing people that were ideological and never changed their mind no matter what the facts were, and said that you had to be, as a leader, as a politician, open to considering new facts. And so what you're suggesting is that if they're actually open to consider new facts and change their mind, you still don't believe them.
No. What I'm saying is that that's a sleight of hand. It's a sleight of hand because those facts and facts on the ground have been known for years. People, not only outside experts, their own generals, our allies have been saying these things for years and years. It's only now, when it became an electoral threat to the very survival of the Liberal Party, that they decided to take action. So it is not that they are, I'm not criticizing them for changing their minds. I'm criticizing them for changing their minds only when it aligned with their electoral fortunes, and presenting it as we just learned about these things. Well, no, this has been the case for years. The lines about defense spending, about making hard choices, about undermining Canada's identity, institutions, its structure is bad for the country, have been screamed for years and years. And not only they ignored it, but they basically suggested, if you are promoting that, you are not, you're not in with the times. And now when it leads to an electoral fortune that seems to almost put the Liberal Party on the third place, and then suddenly Donald Trump comes up as almost a savior through his ridiculous threats regarding Canada's sovereignty, they changed their tune. So it's not that I'm criticizing that they changed their mind. I'm criticizing them that the change of mind didn't come when this has been said again and again and again before. So that's why I'm not really buying into the change of mind, because that's basically a sleight of hand.
We're having an interesting chat tonight about geopolitics, Canada, the Liberal Party, etc., with our Balkan Devlen, our expert from the Macdonald Institute. We're going to take a break and come back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Balkan Devlen. He is a director with the Macdonald Institute. He's an expert in international affairs and foreign policy. He's written several different articles that we've talked about. Sir, I want to ask you, last week, the G7 Foreign Affairs ministers got together in Charlevoix, Quebec. And it would almost appear that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State in the United States, came back on board in regards to thinking about the benefits of multilateralism, about the G7, and about the importance of Ukraine. Are we living in a world where the G7, where NATO actually has a role and can be beneficial, like it would appear happen maybe next week? Or are we living in a world that might be more where it's Russia, China, and America that are almost like Yalta, dividing up the world?
Well, that's the, as they used to say, $64,000 question. And I think the future is not necessarily written yet, right? I want to go back to what I said
but
before.
You're the super forecaster, so you should know the future.
Yes, no, but it is probabilistic assessment, right? What is the probability of we are heading down one way versus the other? And I think at this stage, my concern is that we are more maybe 65%, 66%, so 2/3 maybe down the road of three big powers trying to shape things versus maybe 1/3 probability that we might still salvage some of the institutional structures of the post-Cold War era. So we can go both ways. But the important thing, I think, is that we should not let ourselves be or feel desperate and just admire the problem. As I said earlier in our chat, we shouldn't engage in whack-a-mole when it comes to Donald Trump's announcements and policy ideas. Remember the whole thing about turning Gaza into a hotel resort? That kind of died out and then it was gone away. He throws away things all the time. We need to recognize here in Canada and our European allies that we have agency. We can do things. We have resources. We have interests. We need to figure out what those interests are, have tough conversations with our own people, with our other allies. What needs to be done? What is the price that needs to be paid? What are we willing to do? And do things. We can do things. We don't need to wait for a permission or just be a spectator as other countries, however big they are, sort out things among themselves, and we end up being just the recipient of whatever the crumbs that come down. So I think number one, that there is, we need to understand that we do have agency. We can actually do things. And G7 and NATO and working with our other allies is one way to do so. Europe slowly waking up from its slumber. They recently have this defense summit in Brussels, loosening up the fiscal rules when it comes to deficit spending, putting together a fund somewhere around 800 billion, 600 to 800 billion euros for defense industry. A lot of challenges remain, etc., but they are moving forward. G7 and NATO, in that sense, also provide an opportunity for Canada to amplify our own position, but we need to bring things to the table. We need to be serious about it. Even the talk about getting to 2%, that's gone. That's 10 years ago's problem. Today, we are not only speaking a lot more than 2%, perhaps 2.5% or 3% on average that NATO members need to spend, but also what capabilities and what speed and how. So we need to make tough choices here, but we can make those tough choices because Canada, despite our resources, we do have massive resources, both human capital wise, but also through natural resources. We're not, no offense to Luxembourg or Liechtenstein, but we're not Liechtenstein or Luxembourg. We do have 40 million people, a huge landmass, the second largest landmass in the world of any country, and resources from energy to agriculture to water to minerals. We could do things and leverage them. And doing it through institutions like G7, those small institutions, or NATO, where we actually have a seat at the table, will be meaningful. We shouldn't be doing it just because we have a seat at the table. That's also is another way of, I think, wrong thinking. There's no going back to the golden days, which were never there, of sort of middle power and all that stuff. We need to recognize what Canadian interests are, where those interests are best pursued, and with whom we can pursue those interests. G7 and NATO gives us a table, gives us a seat at the most important tables, economically and militarily. How can we torque that to defend Canadian sovereignty, security, and prosperity, and improve the life of our citizens, first and foremost, but also our friends and allies, because we benefit from that enlightened understanding of self-interest, is what we need to be paying attention to. There is a choice. There is no, as I said, I think I'm pessimistic. I think the road is increasingly off, as you pointed out. Three powers sorting things out among themselves, which is, again, I think, short-sighted. It accords Russia a power that they don't have. But unfortunately, given the current disposition within the White House, that's where we seem to be going. But it is not set in stone. We can change things, and we can do things, and we can defend and protect ourselves in this particular world and try to wear off. This is not the last exit. Right, so there is still time to change. So we should not be despondent about this and just sit down and watch as things happen to us. We do have agency, and we should take that.
So I don't understand it, frankly. Russia's 140 million people. They're being held back by a country that is, less than a third their size, but more than a fifth their size. 40 million people in Ukraine. The European Union is 500 million people. It's bigger than the United States. It's a sizable economic and political and demographic entity. If it got its act together and worked together, China, I understand, huge economic power, both from a population standpoint as well as an economic standpoint, but Russia isn't. How can Russia, with 140 million people, think that they're one of the three countries that should be carving up the world as per Yalta?
There are two answers to it. One, it is part of the Russian strategic culture that self-identity of Russia as a great power being a very important way in which the Russian political elite perceives themselves and their place. They do have one of the sort of the biggest, what I would call one of the biggest problems and mistakes that we did after the collapse of the Soviet Union, is that we never did a process of de-Czechistification. Czechists are the general name given to the security and intelligence apparatus, KGB and others within Russia, referring to Cheka, the early spy agency, intelligence agency of the Soviet Union. We never did that. What we did, in a way, to Germany and Japan afterwards, and therefore they steamed in their grievance and anger and incorporate that sense of stolen rightful place of Russia in the world as a core component. People like Vladimir Putin and around him, right? So it is, in one sense, a self-perception of Russia has always been a great power. We were a great power once, but the West tricked us and stole this away from us. Now we're going to reclaim it. The sad part is that Donald Trump also thinks, because his worldview and vision is shaped in mid 1980s, also sees Russia as, in those terms, as a big, great power that has huge influence around the world. Russia has a sizable military industrial complex and nuclear weapons, but has the GDP of Texas, less than the GDP of Texas.
Sorry, say that again. Has less than the GDP of Texas?
Yes, Russian GDP is less than the GDP of Texas. So we're not talking about a major.
So, obviously having peace is something that we want.
Yes.
And the loss of life is terrible.
Yes.
But when you think about what the last 3 years have done to Russia, it has weakened Russia dramatically. And isn't that to the benefit of the United States and the rest of the world?
One would think, right? But I mean, I think there is 2 points there. Number one, and this is torturing an analogy a little bit here, but Russia is generally portrayed as a bear, right? Well, a wounded bear is still a bear, right? In terms of making a destructive impact. Russia is at a point where the powers that it has can be directed towards destruction, not construction, right? It is not a power that can meaningfully contribute to building a better world. What it can do is that it can play the disruptor. It is powerful enough to spoil things. And that's what they are doing. And it has a political leadership and a security leadership that doesn't care about human life. They've been throwing away to meat grinders their own people. And they believe, and unfortunately we're proving him, Vladimir Putin and his cronies, right, that they believe that they can sustain this longer than the West's political will. Their resources are not infinite. They are doing everything they can to protect and insulate the broader public from the economic impact of the war, but that cannot be sustained forever.
So I think back to
is that he can do it longer.
1943, if I could, and you're the expert, not I. But my understanding is that Churchill really wanted Roosevelt to attack Europe
Yes.
And create a second front in 1943, a year earlier than D-Day. And Roosevelt thought we're not ready and delayed. And what ended up happening during that year is millions of Russians died on the Eastern Front, and that was terrible, no question. Loss of life, terrible. But Roosevelt's attitude was far better the Russians than Americans.
Yeah.
And if Ukraine wants to continue this war and wants our military assistance or the United States military assistance, and they're willing to have that loss of life, no matter how terrible it is, isn't that actually better to have that war take place, to have Ukraine weaken Russia for us, rather than allow Russia to rearm, to take a break, to potentially threaten the. I go back to Munich and appeasement in our time. We thought that it was over. We negotiated, or Chamberlain negotiated, that Hitler wasn't going to take off the balance of Czechoslovakia, which he did promptly a couple of months later, and then less than a year later attacked Poland. So, what does this buy us?
Exactly. So there's a phrase that I keep saying from the beginning of the full-scale invasion in 2022, and that is, supporting Ukraine is not charity; it is self-interest for us. Ukrainians are paying the ultimate price. They're paying with their lives as they defend their home and hearth. All we need to do to enable them to continue to defend their country and their people is to provide the resources to them. We don't want to pay pennies today. We'll pay hundreds of dollars in the future. If you think a few billion here and a few billion there is expensive, wait until We need to fight the Russians in Latvia, in Poland, in the Arctic, and our people are fighting and dying, and we're spending 30% of our GDP for armament. So I agree. Ukraine is defending for its existence as a nation and as a sovereign state. So as long as they want to, they believe that they can win and that they're willing to pay the ultimate price because they are defending their very existence, we have no excuse not to support them. Because as you pointed out, the fall of Ukraine will not necessarily mean that Russians go, okay, we got what we want. Let's go back to the things where we are suddenly reformed. It is not about territory specifically in Ukraine. It is about reasserting Russia as a great power in Europe, vassalizing Ukraine, and putting pressure on Europe. So they might, and they will probably will, rearm and move and continue to threat our European allies and Canada as well. So, as you pointed out, because Ukraine is fighting and dying, they should be the one who will say, this is the concessions we're willing to make. This is the time where we stop fighting and dying. Until that happens, it is way better for the West, for us, to continue to support Ukraine rather than throw Ukraine under the bus. Because if we do, we'll pay a much bigger price down the road as a result of that decision. So I agree with you.
We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments from our expert, Balkan Devlen, in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. So we've been chatting about whether we've got a multi-powered world, whether we've got G7, whether United Nations is relevant versus sort of three powers, Russia, China, and America axis, I guess. Balkan, I wonder, maybe turn to Mark Carney, our newly sworn-in Prime Minister. He's going to go to London and Paris, not the United States. He's not going to go kiss the ring like so many other people have done in Malaga or the Oval Office. Does that make sense? And if you were advising, if you went to the Prime Minister's office today, what would you tell him he should say to the prime ministers of the UK and France? Should he be asking for nuclear support? Should he be asking them to support Canadian territorial integrity? Should he be asking them for free trade agreements? What is it the right strategy? And what should he be asking?
I think, the idea that we can ask British or French nuclear protection is it's just it's a fantasy. It's a virtue signaling. It doesn't have any sort of reality in the geography or the capabilities of those countries or our relationship with the United States. And I think going back to my earlier comment, what we really need to do is reclaim the slogan from the Second World War. A very British slogan. Keep calm and carry on. I think it is symbolic that he's going to France, going to London and Paris first to highlight that Canada has options. But realistically speaking, geography is, as they say, destiny. Geography is definitely destiny when it comes to trade and security relationships. So Canada's place is and will be in North America. Our trade, our people-to-people ties, our military, everything is very much focused on North America and the Arctic. So we need to come to terms with that. This doesn't mean that going in and growling to Donald Trump is the way to go. The guy has a cruel disposition and will not necessarily approach you with kindness if you do that. What you need to do is, I think, to be firm. And he does very clearly has a soft spot for strong leaders who demonstrate backbone. Important, I think, to do that behind closed doors rather than playing for the public out there. I think that is a fine line to walk. Now, Carney's decision to go to London and Paris, if he comes back after that and have a meeting with Donald Trump, I think that might actually suggest a stronger position. Whether he'll do that or not, I don't think so. I don't think politically it serves him from an electoral perspective. I think litigating that from Ottawa rather than having that one-on-one with Donald Trump will be politically the better choice. Whether that is the better choice for the country is a different story, and it's very hard to figure out how that first meeting would go. But my perception is that since Carney is almost a walking avatar of the establishment that Donald Trump seems to be, railing against, twice a central banker and all that. That particular meeting may not necessarily go super well. So it is tough. It's very tough. And talking with the European leaders, as long as he doesn't come up and says some nonsense stuff about defense of Canadian sovereignty against outside threats, etc., implying to the United States, which will be purely for the political base and red meat and doesn't have any reality based in reality. I think that would suggest, at least to me, what kind of a leader he would be going forward.
You're a super forecaster. A year from now, will we still have war in Ukraine? Will we have a trade war with the United States?
Trade war, I think it's a 50-50, to be honest, which means that I am completely uncertain about one way or the other, that I'm happy to take the bet on either side on equal terms. When it comes to war in Ukraine, fortunately, I think there is greater than 70% chance that we will have some kind of conflict going on. It might be reduced. We might have temporary ceasefires that are keep violated, etc. But I do not see a durable agreement by the end of the year that will lead to the stop of the fighting for the long term.
Balkan Devlen, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos go up on my radio show website, briancrombie.com, and on social media and on YouTube and on podcast apps as soon as the radio show goes to air. What an interesting conversation, and what a
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Crazy world we live in.
Yeah, it is.